They say the night screams louder than any whip ever could. In Charleston, 1821, beneath the shadow of magnolia trees and the weight of chains, one woman's rage became legend. Inácia didn't just fight back. She carved her vengeance into flesh, bone, and the dinner table of the most powerful family in the county. This is not a story of mercy. This is a story of blood, justice, and a mother who refused to let her daughter become the next victim. What happened that night would echo through the plantations for generations, whispered in terror by masters and in triumph by the enslaved. Are you ready to witness what happens when silence breaks? The air in Charleston hung thick with humidity and the sickly sweet scent of magnolias. It was late August, 1821, and the Holloway plantation sprawled across hundreds of acres of South Carolina soil, its wealth built on the backs of nearly 200 enslaved men, women, and children. The cotton fields stretched endlessly under the brutal sun, and the big house stood like a white monument to cruelty, its columns gleaming even as the cabins below rotted. Inácia wiped the sweat from her brow as she carried water from the well to the quarters. Her hands were calloused, her back bent from years of labor that started before dawn and ended long after sunset. She was 38 years old, but her body felt ancient. Her face, once beautiful, now carried the map of every injustice she'd endured. Scars hidden beneath her head wrap, bruises that never fully healed, and eyes that had learned to look down. But tonight those eyes burned. Before we continue, if stories like Inácia's move you, stories of courage that history tried to bury, tap that like button and subscribe. There's so much more to uncover. Inácia had 2 daughters. Lucy, 16, worked in the big house under the watchful, jealous eye of Mistress Delilah Holloway. Abby, just 12, still worked the fields, but was beginning to draw unwanted attention. Both girls had inherited their mother's features, high cheekbones, deep brown eyes, and a grace that even bondage couldn't strip away. And Grayson Holloway had noticed. Grayson wasn't the master of the plantation. That title belonged to his aging father, Edmund, but Grayson ran the operation with an iron fist and a twisted sense of entitlement. He was 34, broad-shouldered, with pale eyes that seemed to see enslaved people not as humans, but as property to be used however he pleased. The enslaved whispered about him in the quarters, about the women he'd violated, the men he'd beaten to death, the children he'd sold away from their mothers without a second thought. Inácia knew Grayson better than she wanted to. For 5 years, he'd visited her cabin at night, taking what was never his to take. She'd learned to disappear inside herself during those visits, to let her mind drift somewhere far away while her body remained trapped. She never fought. Fighting meant the whip. Fighting meant watching her daughters suffer, but last night had been different. Last night, Grayson had come to the cabin drunk, reeking of whiskey and tobacco. He'd pushed past Inácia and stood over Abby's sleeping mat, staring down at the child with a hunger that made Inácia's blood run cold. "She's getting to be a woman," Grayson had slurred, crouching down to touch Abby's hair. Inácia had stepped between them. "Please, Master Grayson, she's just a child." His hand had cracked across her face so hard she'd tasted blood. "Don't you tell me what she is. I'll decide that." He'd left that night without touching Abby, but his words lingered like poison. "Tomorrow. I'll come back tomorrow." Now, as the sun set over the plantation and the enslaved people gathered in the quarters for their meager evening meal, Inácia felt something shift inside her. The fear that had kept her compliant for so many years was still there, but it had been joined by something stronger, rage, pure and hot as fire. Letty, an older woman who'd worked the fields for 40 years, sat beside Inácia outside the cabin. She was stirring a pot of thin vegetable stew, her movements slow and deliberate. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Letty said quietly. Inácia didn't respond immediately. She watched Lucy walk back from the big house, her daughter's face carefully blank in the way enslaved people learn to hide their emotions. Lucy met her mother's eyes and gave the slightest shake of her head. Mistress Delilah had been in a foul mood again, probably because she suspected what her stepson did in the quarters at night. "He's coming for Abby," Inácia whispered. Letty's hand stilled. The two women sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of those words settling between them like stones. "Lord have mercy," Letty finally breathed. "There ain't no mercy here," Inácia replied. "There never has been." That night, after the last lantern was extinguished in the big house and the plantation fell into its uneasy sleep, Inácia sat awake in the darkness. Abby slept curled against her sister, both girls exhausted from the day's labor. Inácia watched them breathe, watched the rise and fall of their chests, and felt something break inside her. She'd been broken before, broken by the middle passage, broken by the auction block, broken by every indignity and violation this place had inflicted on her. But this breaking was different. This breaking was clean and sharp, like a blade finally pulled from its sheath. Inácia reached under her sleeping mat and pulled out a small kitchen knife she'd stolen from the big house months ago. She'd hidden it, not knowing why at the time, only that she felt safer having it. The blade caught the moonlight filtering through the cracks in the cabin wall. Tomorrow, Grayson Holloway would come for her daughter. Tomorrow, Inácia would be waiting, and tomorrow the Holloway plantation would learn that even the most broken soul could still cut deep. Write the word justice in the comments if you think Inácia was right to protect her daughter. Morning came too quickly. The plantation bell rang at 4:30, its metallic clang cutting through the humid darkness like a knife. Inácia hadn't slept. She'd spent the night sitting against the cabin wall, the stolen knife pressed against her thigh, her mind turning over plans that would have been unthinkable just days ago. As the enslaved people stumbled from their cabins toward the fields, Inácia moved through her morning. Routine like a ghost, she helped Lucy prepare for her day in the big house, braiding her daughter's hair with trembling fingers. "Mama, your hands are shaking," Lucy whispered, concern creasing her young face. "I'm fine, baby," Inácia lied. "Just tired." Lucy studied her mother with eyes too old for her 16 years. She'd grown up in this hell, learning to read the subtle signs of danger that surrounded them constantly. "Something's wrong." Inácia cupped her daughter's face gently. "You stay in that house today. You stay close to Mistress Delilah. You hear me? Don't go nowhere alone. Mama, promise me, Lucy." The girl nodded slowly, fear flickering across her features. "I promise." After Lucy left for the big house, Inácia sent Abby to work with a group of older women in the vegetable garden, far from the main fields where Grayson typically prowled. Then she reported to her own assignment, the laundry house behind the big house, where she'd spend the day scrubbing the Holloway. Her family's fine linens in water so hot it burned her hands. The laundry house was a small, steaming building with large iron pots suspended over constantly burning fires. Inácia worked alongside 3 other enslaved women, Letty, who she'd spoken with the night before, and 2 younger women named Sarah and May. The work was brutal, the heat oppressive, but today Inácia barely noticed. Her mind was elsewhere. Around midday, she saw him. Grayson Holloway emerged from the big house, adjusting his hat. Against the noon sun, he was dressed in fine clothes, a white linen shirt, dark trousers, leather boots polished to a shine. He looked every inch the gentleman planter, a pillar of Charleston society. No one looking at him would guess what he did in the darkness of the slave quarters. Inácia's hands tightened around the shirt she was washing, her knuckles going white. Grayson surveyed the plantation grounds with the casual authority of someone who'd never been told no in his entire life. His gaze swept past the laundry house, and for a moment his eyes locked with Inácia's. A slow smile spread across his face, and he touched the brim of his hat in mock courtesy. The message was clear. Tonight. Inácia felt bile rise in her throat. She forced herself to look away, to keep scrubbing, to appear as broken and compliant as he expected. But beneath the surface, something was coiling tight. ready to strike. "That man is the devil himself," Letty muttered, keeping her voice low enough that only Inácia could hear. "Born of evil and nursed on cruelty. Devils can bleed same as anyone," Inácia replied quietly. Letty shot her a sharp look but said nothing more. The afternoon dragged on. Inácia's body went through the motions of work while her mind raced through scenarios. She knew the layout of her cabin perfectly, where the shadows fell, where the floor creaked, where she could position herself. She knew Grayson's habits too, learned through 5 years of violation. He always came late when the plantation was asleep. He always came alone, confident in his power. He always expected submission. That confidence would be his undoing. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, the enslaved people were finally released from their labor. They trudged back to the quarters, exhausted and hungry, to eat whatever meager rations had been provided. Inácia found Abby safe with the other women. Her younger daughter's hands were dirty. From working in the garden, her face streaked with sweat, but she was unharmed. Inácia pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her child's hair, memorizing it. "Mama, you're holding too tight," Abby protested, but didn't pull away. "I love you," Inácia whispered. "I love you more than breath itself. Don't you ever forget that." Abby pulled back, confusion and fear warring in her expression. "What's happening?" "Nothing, baby. Just eat your food." That evening, as darkness fell over the plantation like a shroud, Inácia made her preparations. She sharpened the kitchen knife against a stone until the edge gleamed. She positioned it beneath her sleeping mat where she could reach it quickly. She checked the cabin door. It had no lock, of course. Enslaved people weren't allowed privacy or security. Lucy and Abby watched their mother with growing alarm. But Inácia shook her head when Lucy tried to speak. "Go to sleep, both of you. Everything's going to be all right." It was perhaps the biggest lie she'd ever told. The plantation settled into its nighttime rhythm. Lanterns were extinguished. Voices faded to whispers, then to silence. Inácia sat in the darkness, her hand resting on the place where the knife lay hidden, and waited. Around midnight, she heard footsteps approaching the cabin. Heavy, unsteady. Grayson had been drinking as usual. The door opened without ceremony, without even a knock. He filled the doorway, backlit by moonlight, his features cast in shadow. "Wake up, Inácia," he slurred, already unbuckling his belt. "And wake that pretty little daughter of yours. Time she learned what she's good for." In the darkness, Inácia's fingers closed around the knife's handle. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest, but her hand was steady. "Master Grayson," she said softly, standing. "Why don't you come over here first?" "Like always." He laughed, a cruel sound. "Eager tonight? That's different." He moved toward her, confident, entitled, already reaching for her. Inácia stepped closer, closing the distance between them until she could smell the whiskey on his breath. She thought of every night he'd violated her. She thought of every bruise, every humiliation, every moment she'd wanted to die. She thought of Abby, sleeping innocently just feet away, about to have that innocence destroyed. And then she stopped thinking altogether. The knife moved almost of its own accord, fast and sure in the darkness. Grayson's eyes went wide with shock, his mouth opening in a cry that Inácia muffled with her other hand. He stumbled backward, hands clutching at himself, trying to understand what had just happened. "You don't touch my daughter," Inácia whispered, her voice carrying the weight of 5 years of silence. "You don't touch any of us ever again." Grayson fell to his knees, blood pooling dark beneath him in the moonlight. And in that moment, watching him fall, Inácia felt something she hadn't felt in years. Power. What would you have done in that cabin? Comment fight or flight, and be honest. I'll read them all. For a moment that stretched into eternity, Inácia stood frozen, the bloodied knife still clutched in her hand. Grayson Holloway writhed on the floor of the cabin, his hands pressed between his legs, trying desperately to stem the bleeding. His mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air, shock robbing him of his voice before pain could give it back. Behind her, Inácia heard Lucy gasp, awake and witnessing everything. Abby remained asleep, mercifully ignorant of what was unfolding. "Mama!" Lucy's voice was barely a whisper, trembling with terror and something else, something that might have been relief. Inácia didn't turn around. Her eyes remained fixed on the man who had terrorized her family for years, watching as his face contorted, as his fine clothes became soaked with blood. The moonlight streaming through the cabin's cracks illuminated the scene in stark detail. There would be no pretending this was a dream. Grayson finally found his voice. It came out as a strangled scream that shattered the night silence. Inácia moved fast. She grabbed a rag from the washing basket and shoved it into his mouth, muffling the sound. Then she leaned close, her face inches from his, and spoke in a voice so cold it could have frozen the humid Charleston air. "You scream again, and I'll finish what I started. You understand me?" His pale eyes, wild with pain and disbelief, locked onto hers. For the first time in his life, Grayson Holloway was looking at an enslaved person and seeing not property, but something dangerous, something that could end him. He nodded weakly. "Lucy," Inácia said, still not looking away from Grayson. "Light the lantern, quick now." Her daughter scrambled to obey, her hands shaking so badly it took 3 attempts to strike the flint. When the flame finally caught and light filled the cabin, the full horror of what Inácia had done became visible. Blood covered the floor, dark and spreading. Grayson's face had gone grey, his breathing shallow and rapid. "Is he dying?" Lucy asked, her voice high and thin. "Not yet," Inácia replied. She retrieved what she'd cut from him, the physical evidence of his manhood, his power, his entitlement to violate anyone he chose. She wrapped it carefully in a clean cloth, her movements deliberate and unhurried despite the urgency of the situation. Lucy's eyes went wide. "Mama, what are you doing?" Inácia finally looked at her daughter. In the lamplight, she could see Lucy's face, the fear, yes, but also something else, a fierce pride that mirrored what Inácia herself was feeling. Her daughter understood. In this world that gave them no justice, sometimes you had to carve it out yourself. "Do you trust me?" Inácia asked. Lucy nodded without hesitation. "Then help me move him." Together, mother and daughter dragged Grayson's semi-conscious body toward the back of the cabin. He was a large man, heavy with privilege and fine food, but desperation made them strong. They propped him against the wall, binding his hands and feet with rope typically used for securing cotton bales. Inácia gagged him properly with strips of fabric. "He'll die if we leave him like this," Lucy whispered. "Maybe," Inácia acknowledged, "but I need time." "Time for what?" Inácia held up the cloth-wrapped bundle. "To cook." Lucy's confusion transformed into shocked understanding. "Mama, no." "Yes." Inácia's voice was firm. "They need to know. All of them, the mistress, the master, every white person on this plantation. They need to know what he was, what he did. They need to taste it." It was insane. It was unthinkable. It was also the only way Inácia could make sure that even if she was killed for this, and she would be, the truth would be impossible to ignore or bury. The 2 women worked quickly. Lucy kept watch at the door, while Inácia took the bundle to the outdoor cooking pit behind the quarters, where enslaved people prepared their own meals. The fire had burned down to embers, but she stoked it back to life. She worked with the efficiency of someone who'd spent years cooking for others, preparing a dish she would never have imagined in her darkest nightmares. As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Inácia finished her grim task. She'd prepared what looked like a meat pie, the kind she'd made hundreds of times for the Holloway family's table, the kind they praised and devoured without ever thinking about the hands that made it. But this pie contained a very different kind of meat. "Mama, they'll hang you for this," Lucy said, tears streaming down her face. "They'll burn you. "I know," Inácia interrupted gently. She cupped her daughter's face with hands that still smelled of blood despite washing. "But your sister will be safe. You'll both be safe. He can't hurt you anymore." "What about you?" Inácia smiled, and it was the saddest smile Lucy had ever seen. "I stopped being safe the day I was put in chains, but I can still choose how my story ends." As the plantation bell rang at 4:30, calling the enslaved to another day of labor, Inácia carried her creation toward the big house. Lucy walked beside her, both women moving through the humid morning like ghosts. They found Letty near the big house kitchen, already starting preparations for the family's breakfast. The older woman took one look at Inácia's face and knew something momentous had occurred. "Lord have mercy," Letty breathed. "There's no mercy today," Inácia replied, echoing her words from the previous evening. She handed the pie to Letty. "This is for the family's dinner tonight. Make sure it's served. Make sure they all eat it." Letty's hands trembled as she accepted the dish. She looked at it, then at Inácia, understanding dawning in her ancient eyes. "Girl, what have you done? What needed doing?" Inácia turned to leave, then paused. "When they ask, and they will, you tell them Inácia made it. You tell them it was my special recipe." "Where's Master Grayson?" Letty asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "In my cabin. Still alive for now. Probably not for much longer." Inácia walked back to the quarters with her daughter, the rising sun painting the sky in shades of orange and red like a warning. Behind them, the big house stood white and imposing, unaware that within hours its walls would echo with screams. In her cabin, Grayson Holloway had stopped moving. His chest still rose and fell with shallow breaths, but his eyes had rolled back. Inácia checked his bonds one last time, then sat down on the floor beside her sleeping daughter Abby, who remained miraculously unaware. Lucy sat on her other side. "What do we do now?" "We wait," Inácia replied simply. "We wait for truth to come to dinner." And as the plantation came alive with the sounds of another day of bondage and suffering, Inácia closed her eyes and allowed herself for just a moment to feel something like peace. From 1 to 10, how brutal was that? Throw a number in the comments and leave a like if this part touched you. The day passed in surreal slowness. Inácia went through the motions of her work in the laundry house, her hands moving automatically while her mind remained elsewhere. The other women sensed something had changed. There was a tension in the air like the stillness before a storm, but no one asked questions. In the world of the enslaved, sometimes ignorance was protection. Around noon, the commotion began. Mistress Delilah's shrill voice pierced through the plantation, calling for her stepson. Servants were dispatched to find Master Grayson, but he was nowhere to be found. His horse remained in the stable. His hat hung on its usual peg in the big house. His father, old Master Edmund, grew irritated at the disruption, demanding to know where the boy had gone without informing anyone. Inácia kept her head down and continued scrubbing linens, her heart pounding but her face carefully blank. Beside her, Letty worked in unusual silence, occasionally glancing at Inácia with an expression that mixed horror and awe. As afternoon bled into evening, the search for Grayson intensified. Overseers checked the fields, the stables, the smokehouse, even the quarters, though they barely glanced into the individual cabins. White people rarely looked closely at the enslaved people's living spaces. They were beneath notice, places of misery, not worth their attention. If they'd looked more carefully at Inácia's cabin, they would have found Grayson still propped against the back wall, now barely conscious, his life bleeding away slowly in the darkness. But they didn't look, and by the time anyone thought to search more thoroughly, it would be too late. At 6 o'clock, the dinner bell rang from the big house. This was the Holloways' main meal of the day, when the family gathered around their mahogany table laden with food prepared by enslaved hands. Tonight was special. Old Master Edmund's younger brother was visiting from Virginia, along with his wife and 2 grown sons. It was a dinner party, an occasion for the plantation's finest. In the kitchen, Lucy worked alongside 3 other enslaved women under the direction of the Holloways' cook, an older woman named Ruth who'd served the family for 30 years. The table was set with fine china and crystal. Silver gleamed under candlelight, and at the center of The table, steam rising from its golden crust, sat Inácia's pie. "That looks mighty fine," Ruth commented, admiring the presentation. Inácia outdid herself. "Almost seems too pretty to eat." Lucy felt her stomach turn but kept her expression neutral. Mama's always been good with her hands. As the White family gathered around the table, Master Edmund at the head, Mistress Delilah to his right, their Virginia relatives filling out the sides, the enslaved house servants began bringing out the meal. There was roasted chicken, rice with gravy, collard greens, cornbread, and various other dishes that represented the wealth extracted from enslaved labor. But the pie drew the most attention. "What's this?" Master Edmund's brother, Thomas, asked appreciatively. "Meat pie? Delightful!" "Our cook Ruth has outdone herself," Mistress Delilah preened, taking credit as she always did for food she'd never touched. "Actually," Ruth interjected carefully, "this particular dish was prepared by one of the veiled hands, Inácia. She has quite the talent." "Well then, let's sample this talented woman's creation," Thomas declared, reaching for the serving knife. In the kitchen, Lucy's hands trembled so violently she nearly dropped the pitcher of water she was holding. The other servants glanced at her curiously, but she couldn't explain, couldn't warn, couldn't do anything but watch through the doorway as the man cut into her mother's revenge. The pie's interior was revealed: meat in rich brown gravy, vegetables, a filling that looked absolutely ordinary. Thomas served generous portions to everyone at the table, the adults laughing and chatting about politics and cotton prices and the incompetence of their enslaved workers. "To family," Master Edmund declared, raising his wineglass, "and to prosperity." They ate. For several minutes there was only the sound of silverware against china, of contented chewing, of compliments passed around the table. The meat was tender, well-seasoned, cooked to perfection. Mistress Delilah had 2 helpings. Master Edmund proclaimed it the finest pie he'd tasted in years. Then someone asked the question that would shatter everything. "Has anyone seen Grayson today?" Thomas inquired. "I was hoping to discuss some business with him." An uncomfortable silence fell over the table. Master Edmund's expression darkened. "The boy's disappeared. Been gone all day without a word. Probably off in Charleston drinking and whoring if I know him. Such language." At the dinner table, Delilah chided, though her pinched expression suggested she thought the same thing. It was young Charles, Thomas's eldest son, who noticed Lucy standing frozen in the doorway, her face drained of color, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. "What's wrong with that girl?" he asked, pointing. All eyes turned to Lucy. She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. How could she explain? How could she tell them what they'd just consumed? Before Lucy could find her voice, a commotion erupted from outside. Raised voices shouting, someone running toward the big house. An overseer named Crawford burst through the front door without ceremony, his face pale. "Master Edmund," he gasped. "We found him. We found Master Grayson." "Well, it's about damn time," Edmund blustered. "Where's that boy been?" "Sir," Crawford interrupted, something he would never normally do. "You need to come. Now. He's—" The overseer's eyes darted to the dinner table, to the remains of the pie, and something like horrified understanding crossed his features. "Dear God, what is it, man? Speak clearly." "He's in the quarters, sir. In one of the cabins. He's been attacked. Badly. He might not survive." Crawford swallowed hard. "And there's something missing, something that—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Mistress Delilah dropped her fork. The metallic clang against her china plate seemed unnaturally loud. "Missing? What do you mean, missing?" Lucy chose that moment to speak, her voice barely above a whisper but clear enough to be heard by everyone in the room. "You just ate it." The silence that followed was absolute. No one moved. No one breathed. They all sat frozen, their minds struggling to process what the enslaved girl had just said. Then Mistress Delilah screamed. It was a sound of pure horror, primal and ear-splitting. She stumbled from her chair, hand over her mouth, and vomited onto the fine carpet. Her brother-in-law's wife followed suit. Master Edmund's face turned purple with rage and disgust, while his brother Thomas stared at his plate as if it had transformed into a nest of vipers. "What have you done?" Edmund roared, rising to his feet. "What have you filthy—" But he couldn't finish. He too was overcome, rushing from the room toward the nearest chamber pot. In the chaos, Lucy ran. She fled from the big house, across the yard, toward the quarters where her mother waited. Behind her, the screams of white people who just learned that their privilege and power could be fed back to them, bite by terrible bite, echoed through the Charleston night. The reckoning had begun, and there would be no turning back from what came next. Write the truth in the comments if you're ready to see what happens when they find out. This is where everything explodes. Lucy found her mother exactly where she'd left her that morning, sitting on the floor of the cabin, Abby's sleeping form cradled in her lap, Grayson Holloway's body, slumped against the far wall, finally still. He'd died sometime during the day, his life draining away while the plantation searched for him everywhere except where he actually lay. "Mama!" Lucy gasped, breathless from running. "They know! They all know!" Inácia looked up at her eldest daughter and smiled, a real smile, perhaps the first genuine expression of peace Lucy had seen on her mother's face in years. "Good. Let them know. Let them choke on what they've done to us." Outside, the plantation had erupted into chaos. Overseers were running toward the quarters, their faces twisted with rage and disgust. Dogs barked, white men shouted orders, lanterns bobbed through the darkness like angry fireflies. "They're coming for you," Lucy said, tears streaming down her face. "Mama, they're going to kill you." "I know, baby." Inácia stood carefully, laying Abby gently on the sleeping mat without waking her. "But they can't take what I already gave away." "What do you mean?" Inácia cupped Lucy's face with both hands, memorizing every feature. "I was dead the day they put me in chains, dead the first time that man violated me, dead every morning I woke up in bondage. But tonight, for the first time in years, I'm alive. Can you understand that?" Lucy couldn't speak through her sobs, but she nodded. The cabin door exploded inward. Overseer Crawford stood in the entrance, flanked by 3 other white men carrying rifles and torches. Their faces were masks of fury, but Crawford's also showed something else: fear. These men suddenly understood that the people they'd oppressed and dehumanized for so long were capable of striking back in ways they'd never imagined. "Inácia," Crawford said, his voice shaking. "Come out here, now! Don't you touch her!" Lucy screamed, throwing herself between the men and her mother. One of the overseers raised his rifle butt to strike the girl, but Inácia moved faster. She grabbed her daughter and pulled her back, then stepped forward willingly. "I'll come," she said calmly. "Don't hurt my daughters. They had nothing to do with this. This was all me, all you." Crawford laughed bitterly. "You carved up Master Grayson like a butchered hog and fed him to his own family. This is beyond anything." He stopped, unable to find words for the enormity of what she'd done. "He was going to rape my 12-year-old daughter," Inácia said clearly, her voice carrying across the gathering crowd of enslaved people who'd emerged from their cabins. "He'd already raped me countless times, for years. He raped women all over this plantation, and nobody stopped him because you didn't care, because we're not human to you. We're property." "Shut your mouth!" another overseer shouted, striking her across the face with the back of his hand. Inácia stumbled but didn't fall. Blood trickled from her split lip. She straightened and looked the man directly in the eyes. Another act of defiance that would have earned punishment on any other day. But this wasn't any other day. "Go ahead," she said. "Kill me, but you can't unkill him. You can't uneat what you ate. That's inside you now. Part of you. You'll taste it every time you close your eyes." "Take her," Crawford ordered, his voice barely controlled. They dragged Inácia from the cabin. Lucy tried to follow, but Letty and other women from the quarters held her back, their grips gentle but firm. "Let your mama do what she needs to do," Letty whispered. "Don't make it harder." Behind them, Abby woke to the commotion. her sleepy confusion transforming into terror as she realized her mother was being taken away. Her screams joined Lucy's, creating a chorus of anguish that rang through the quarters. The white men brought Inácia to the center of the plantation, where a large oak tree stood, the same tree where enslaved people had been whipped, hanged, and burned before. A crowd had gathered, the Holloway family still pale and sickened from their dinner revelation. Other, white plantation owners from neighboring properties drawn by the scandal, and virtually every enslaved person who could risk being there, watching from the shadows. Master Edmund stood before Inácia, his face mottled with rage and grief. He'd lost his son, a cruel son, but his son nonetheless. The fact that the loss had come at the hands of someone he'd considered less than human was incomprehensible to him. "Do you have anything to say?" he demanded. Inácia looked past him, her eyes finding Lucy in the crowd, then scanning until she spotted other women she knew, women who'd suffered the same violations she had, who'd had their children sold away, who'd been beaten and broken by this system. She saw recognition in their faces, understanding, and something that looked almost like gratitude. She turned her gaze back to Master Edmund. "Yes," she said clearly, "I'd do it again. Tentar novamente continuar editar." The crowd erupted. White voices screamed for immediate execution. Enslaved voices remained silent, but their eyes spoke volumes. Some showed fear, others showed something dangerously close to admiration. Master Edmund's hand trembled as he pointed at Inácia. "You will burn for this, not a quick hanging, no. You'll burn alive so every slave on this plantation remembers what happens when they forget their place." "We never forgot our place," Inácia replied, her voice steady despite the death sentence just pronounced. "You just forgot we were human." Crawford moved to bind her to the oak tree, but Edmund held up his hand. "No, not the tree. That's too quick, too merciful. Build a pyre, make it high. I want this to last." The overseers scrambled to obey, gathering wood from the plantation's stores, piling it in the clearing. The work took nearly an hour, during which Inácia was forced to stand and watch her own execution being prepared. The enslaved people remained in their watching places, forbidden to leave, forced to witness what rebellion would cost them. Lucy broke free from the women holding her and ran to her mother. She collapsed at Inácia's feet, wrapping her arms around her mother's legs. "Please," she sobbed, "please don't leave us. We need you." Inácia knelt down despite the overseer's attempt to pull her back. She held her daughter close, breathing in the scent of her hair one final time. "Listen to me, Lucy. You listen good. You're strong, stronger than you know. You take care of your sister. You survive. You have children someday. And you tell them about tonight. You tell them their grandmother wasn't property. You hear me?" "I hear you, Mama," Lucy wept. "And you tell them this. They can chain our bodies, but they can't chain what's inside. They can take everything from us except the choice to fight back. Remember that." The overseers pulled them apart. Lucy screamed as they dragged her mother toward the pyre, but other enslaved women held her back again, their own faces wet with tears. They bound Inácia to a post in the center of the woodpile. She didn't struggle. Her eyes remained fixed on her daughters, Lucy still fighting against the arms that held her. Abby collapsed on the ground, too young to fully comprehend what was happening, but understanding that her mother was leaving forever. Master Edmund approached with a torch, its flames dancing in the humid night air. "Any final words?" he asked, though his tone suggested he hoped she'd beg for mercy so he could deny it. Inácia looked around at the assembled crowd last time. She saw Letty, tears streaming down her weathered face. She saw other women she'd worked beside for years, women whose names she knew, whose stories of suffering mirrored her own. She saw the white faces too, some gleeful, some uncomfortable, some simply indifferent to the murder about to be committed. And she saw, in the shadows beyond the torchlight, the faces of enslaved men and women whose expressions were changing. Something was shifting behind their carefully blank masks. Fear was still there, yes, but it was being joined by something else, something that looked like awakening. "My name is Inácia," she said, her voice carrying across the clearing. "I was born free in Africa. I was stolen. I was chained. I was sold. I was raped. But I never stopped being human. And tonight I proved that even the powerless can make the powerful taste their own poison." She paused, her eyes finding Lucy's one more time. "To every mother here, every father, every child in chains, they can kill me, but they can't kill what I've shown you. That we can fight back, that we can make them pay, that we are not their property, no matter what their laws say." "Enough!" Edmund roared, hurling the torch into the pyre. The kindling caught immediately. Flames raced up the dry wood, generating heat that drove back the crowd. Smoke began to rise, thick and acrid. Inácia coughed as the smoke reached her, her eyes watering, but she didn't scream. Not yet. Lucy's voice rose above the crackling. "Flames. I love you, Mama. I love you." "I love you too, baby," Inácia called back, her voice already rough from smoke. "Both of you. Don't forget." The flames reached her then, cutting off her words with a gasp of pain. But even as fire consumed her dress, as her skin began to blister and burn, Inácia kept her eyes open. She kept them fixed on her daughters, pouring every ounce of love and strength she had left across the distance between them. The crowd watched in horrified silence as Inácia burned. The white observers expected screaming, begging, the breakdown of a slave who'd overstepped and was now receiving just punishment. But Inácia gave them none of that. She endured the flames with a terrible dignity that unnerved them more than any amount of screaming would have. It was only at the very end, when the pain became truly unbearable, that she finally screamed. But even that sound carried something other than mere agony. It carried defiance. It carried rage. It carried a promise that this wasn't over, that her death would not be the end of the story, but the beginning of something else. And then Inácia was gone, her body consumed by flames that reached toward the Charleston sky like a beacon. The enslaved people were forced to stand and watch until the fire burned down to embers. Then they were sent back to their cabins with orders to be in the fields before dawn, because even murder and horror couldn't interrupt the plantation's schedule. Cotton needed picking, rice needed harvesting. The machine of slavery ground on, indifferent to individual suffering. But something had changed. In the quarters that night, people whispered. They whispered about Inácia's courage. They whispered about what she'd done to Grayson Holloway, how she'd made him into a meal for his own family. The story was already becoming legend, growing with each retelling. "She made them eat him," someone breathed in the darkness. "She wasn't afraid," another voice added. "Not even at the end. If she could fight back, maybe we can too." Lucy held her sister close in their cabin, both girls shaking with grief and shock. But even through her tears, Lucy remembered her mother's final words. She remembered the promise she'd made. She would survive. She would remember. She would tell the story. Around them, the plantation tried to settle back into its routine. Master Edmund posted extra guards and imposed stricter rules. Overseers carried more weapons. The white families tried to forget what they'd eaten at that dinner table, tried to scrub the taste of their own cruelty from their mouths. But they couldn't forget. The story of Inácia had been carved into Charleston's history as surely as she'd carved her vengeance into Grayson Holloway's flesh. In the weeks and months that followed, whispers of Inácia's rebellion spread beyond the Holloway plantation. The story traveled through the underground networks of enslaved people, passed along in coded songs and whispered conversations. In some versions, she became a witch who'd cursed the white family. In others, she was an avenging angel sent to punish evil. The truth and the legend blurred together until it was impossible to separate them. But the core of the story remained the same. A woman who'd been treated as property had proven she was human. A mother who'd been powerless had claimed power in the most brutal way imaginable. A slave who was supposed to accept her fate had instead rewritten it. Inácia's daughters survived, Lucy worked in the big house until the Civil War ended slavery 44 years later. She lived to see emancipation, to see her own children and grandchildren born free. And to every one of them, she told the story of her mother, the woman who'd been enslaved but never broken, who'd fought back against a system designed to crush her, who'd made the powerful literally consume their own corruption. Abby, too young to remember everything clearly, carried the story as something more like a dream, a nightmare and a triumph intertwined. She remembered her mother's love, her mother's strength, and the night the sky burned orange with both tragedy and defiance. The Holloway plantation never recovered its former prosperity. Master Edmund died 2 years after Inácia's execution, some said from the shame of what his family had unknowingly consumed. The property was sold off piece by piece. By the time the Civil War erupted, little remained of the empire built on enslaved labor. But Inácia's story survived. It survived in the whispered legends of Charleston's black community. It survived in the warnings white families gave their sons about treating enslaved women cruelly. It survived in the fear that crept into the hearts of slave owners whenever they looked at the people they'd oppressed and wondered what vengeance might be brewing behind those carefully blank faces. Because Inácia had proven something that terrified the architects of slavery, that the system's victims could strike back. That powerlessness was an illusion that could be shattered with courage and fury. That justice, denied by the courts and the laws and the entire structure of society, could still be claimed, carved out with blood and fire and an unbending will to protect those you loved. Her name became a warning and an inspiration. To the enslavers, be careful how you treat those you've chained, because chains can break and vengeance has no limits. To the enslaved, even in the darkest moments, resistance is possible. And on certain hot Charleston nights, when the air hangs heavy with humidity and the scent of magnolias, some people swear they can still smell smoke on the wind. Not just the smoke of burning wood, but something deeper. The smoke of a system that would eventually burn itself down, consumed by its own cruelty, fed on its own flesh, destroyed by the very people it tried to erase. Inácia's legend lived on because her truth was too powerful to die. She'd been enslaved, violated, and murdered, but in her final act, she'd also been free, more free than her oppressors could ever be, trapped as they were in their own moral rot. The story of the enslaved woman who made her master into a meal, who burned rather than beg, who chose how her story would end even when everything else had been taken from her. That story could never be silenced. Because some fires, once lit, never truly go out. They just wait in the darkness, ready to ignite again whenever someone else finds the courage to strike the match. And Inácia had shown them all how to strike it. Inácia paved the way. But what comes now is indescribable. And click on the video on the screen and check it out now.